349, Chapter 28. Book Talk begins at 8:40. Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from the shores of the Potomac in Virginia, the Old Dominion. Episode 349, Existential Blues. This episode brought to you by Survival Organs, handmade organs to throw, love, or cuddle. And Knit Circus, the e-newsletter bringing you 3 rings of knitting, sewing, and fun. You can find out more at www.knitcircus.com. And March Hare Yarns, hand-dyed yarn just for you. You can visit the March Hare at Etsy. And Pennywise Consulting, technology solutions for your small business. Links to all of our sponsors' pages can be found in the show notes at craftlit.com. Remember, their support for the show is what keeps it free for you. So go take a look. Well, hello. I hope you are doing well. Someone mentioned that Mercury is in retrograde. I don't know if it still is or not, but that, of course, made me concerned for all of us. And actually, come to think of it, that may have something to do with the name of the podcast this week. Actually, the name of the podcast is because some morning last week, I don't remember which one, I woke up with this song in my head. This song, Existential Blues, was a song I heard when I was in 8th grade. I taped it off of the Dr. Demento Funny 5. And for all you young whippersnappers, what I mean when I say I taped it is that I had a cassette recorder next to my speaker. And I recorded the song off the radio, and I must have listened to it, a conservative estimate, probably 200 or 300 times. And I haven't thought about it in 20 years. And all of a sudden I wake up and all the lyrics, all the music, everything, every last detail is going through my mind. And I thought, I wonder if it's on YouTube. So I went and looked, and you will find a link to a video file of the song as it was originally recorded. It has film from The Man of La Mancha playing. So don't pay any attention to the movie. If you listen to the entire song, it will make sense why they showed The Man of La Mancha. And the reason why I'm linking to that and not a different version is because the different versions that are on YouTube have clipped part of the song out. I am assuming for legal reasons, but this particular one has not been taken down. So enjoy it in its full grandeur and real complete weirdness. But I learned a lot of terminology, like the song Existential Blues made me go and look up existentialism when I was in 8th grade. And so there were lots of jokes that I wound up being able to understand just because of that completely whacked out song. So I have that link for you in my completely random weirdness, and a link to the new OK Go video. If you remember a few years back, there was a band, OK Go. They did a treadmill dance choreography. I guess they choreographed a video to a set of treadmills, and it was really spectacular choreography, and amazing that none of them fell and hurt themselves. Well, this video is even way more cooler than that because grammar is malleable. So they made this new video, and it blew my mind. They keep now, I think the last 2 videos, big videos that they released, are kind of Rube Goldberg devicey kinds of things. And wow, pretty amazing. And I think I saw that there was a behind the scenes thing as well. So if there is, I will link to that as well. But do enjoy. It's a lovely little song, and it's an amazing video. So enjoy that. I am going to be cruising along at a fast clip for this week and next, as I have to pre-record a lot and move next week. I know, you're shocked. What? Move? But you always stay in the same place, Heather. I will perpetrate my last move. I will undergo the final move of the 3. Never move 3 times in 2 months. Please, please, please learn from my mistakes. Dear Lord. So next Friday, the 27th, I will be heading out of Dodge and heading up to Pennsylvania. And that is where I will sit until you hear me podcasting from, I still don't know where in Pennsylvania. I have no idea what to say. So I'll come up with something. But the day that I move is very close to the last day that you will be able to participate in the Rag Rug Weaving book giveaway. The link to that giveaway is at the top of the show notes at craftlit.com, episode 349. Follow that link and you will see a little Rafflecopter widget towards the bottom of the page. And that will tell you all the different ways that you can enter. Super painless, easy to do. Chooses someone automatically, randomly from the kitty of names that the little widget has collected. And that brings me to Nanette the Nanny's books. The lots have been selected. You can see the lots at the bottom of this episode's show notes page. They are identified by lot number, and you can see exactly which books are in the lot. And Nanette also gave me a bunch of work bags. Some of them are little sock bags. Some of them are more like backpacky bags. Some of them are more biggish yarn project bags. And those are being scattered throughout the lots as well. Now, the details for how to participate in this fundraising raffle will be forthcoming in a Craftlit newsletter over the weekend. That means if you see a book or several books that you really want and you want to help Nanette out, you would be best served if you have signed up for the Craftlit newsletter. We'll send out the instructions this weekend. And then if you aren't signed up for the newsletter, but you are on Facebook, we will have instructions on the Craftlit pages there. And if you're on Twitter, we will have Twitter information going out. Just follow at Craftlit or at Mama O. And either way, you will find out all the information you need in order to have a chance at the books. So that's exciting. Finally, I know it's been a long time coming, but I'm very happy to be able to help Nanette out in a pinch. And yay, really wonderful books. I mean, so quite a few books that are out of print. So we're identifying those books as well. So you'll be able to make an informed decision. Thank you very much, those of you who responded to the cognitive anchoring poll. It looks like there's quite a few people who would like me to do a webinar or some kind of online delivery of my cognitive anchoring talk. So I will be figuring out a delivery device and building that online version of the talk, and I'll get that out to you as soon as I can. But north and south. Ooh, do we have an interesting chapter for you? Last week, Mama G, and thank you so much, was good enough to copy and paste her post from one of the Ravelry discussions on the Craftlit board, which I seriously just have not had a chance to get to for a couple of months. It's this bloody gainful employment. It's just really causing trouble. But Mama G's post, I thought, was very interesting, and I really can't disagree with anything. She says, I was holding judgment of Mrs. Hale and Mr. Hale, but I'm done. I am sympathetic to her physical plight, but what a whiner. I'd forgotten how deep under the skin irritating her complaining is. Which leads me to this thought. Is it a rule that the romantic Victorian writers have such feeble parents? Earlier, I had noted that the Hales need to be largely out of pocket so that Margaret can, like any good fairy tale girl, spread her wings and have her adventure that brings her to adulthood. Elizabeth Bennet has the same experience in Pride and Prejudice. Maybe I answered my own question. In both cases, the mothers are concerned with the self, not necessarily narcissistically, but their interest in their daughters is unfocused. Mrs. Bennet, at least, is obsessed with her daughters and her own future. She may be obnoxious, but at least she is aware of them. Mrs. Hale, as we see her, is horrible. Was it really the fashion to tell a child she was ugly? Over and over? I don't tell my children they're beautiful, but I don't compare them. Really, I don't. Or natter on about their physical beauty. Margaret just takes it gracefully. I mean, really. Margaret, Frederick was so beautiful. I saw you and I said, oh, what an ugly baby. Heathers expressed her frustration with Mr. Hale and his dim-witted professor approach to life. My term, not putting words into her mouth, although you're welcome to because those were good words. And I agree. He skates the surface of his relationship with Margaret, but he seems to acknowledge how heavily he leans on her, whereas Mrs. Hale leans and pushes and doesn't think about it. Bring Frederick. How about noticing your daughter having some kind of gash on her head where she was knocked with a rock? Mr. Bennet is also the dim-witted professor, taking more interest in his library than his children and wife. There are so many places in the text where his disdain is thick and painful to read. I really do have to take a deep breath and consider the time and social norms with these relationships. I want Margaret to say something, though I know she never will. I want her to shake her mother. I want her to point out the big knock on her head to her father. But that isn't what will happen. Those 19th century girls challenging the world, but won't tell their parents to stick it. And this week's chapter is going to fall so squarely in the middle of everything that Mama G just wrote. And by the way, I hope I did it justice. Her writing is really fun to read out loud, so I had fun. So Mama G's preemptive strike on this week's chapter is fortuitous because things do start to alter just a bit. So far, we really have seen Margaret just kind of not even react to some of the, as Mama G said, horrible things that have been said around her, to her, about her. And we can kind of chalk that up to being the good Victorian girl. And I think some of that is because Gaskell, my guess is Gaskell could really only push things so far before people wouldn't want to read her story anymore. Margaret is way out in front of so many other things in the Victorian world in the way she takes charge of things and even the ways that she speaks to Mr. Thornton. She is so not a, wilting flower at all. But in today's chapter, her mother is going to say something and Margaret is going to bite her tongue. And the only clue Gaskell gives us is that she makes a carriage return, or in her case, drops down to the next line and writes, Margaret was silent. And that's it. That's all we get. But it's the first time I can remember having that happen, where it's split away from the other paragraphs and it is simply said, not implied, actually stated. And then it goes on from there where we do get to see a little bit inside Margaret's mind and how difficult a time she is having coming up with small talk after her mother's whining at that point. So yes, some of this can just be chalked up to, like young adult fiction these days. Harry Potter is an orphan. All of these kind of coming of age books, the kids aren't there with their parents. In Twilight, Bella's away from her mother and her father works all the time. In The Hunger Games, Katniss is sent off alone away from her family. Her father's dead. This is classic trope for young adult literature. And in many ways, a lot of the books that we read on Craftlit would, I suppose, kind of fall under that style, that kind of storytelling structure or trope. And that's fine, really. But I know I have a harder time, and it seems like some of you are having a harder time too, with the useless parent. Absent parent is one thing, fine. Useless parent is really frustrating. And useless kind of cruel, casually cruel, not purposefully cruel, but just kind of, accidentally mean. Those kind of parents are really hard to read, and they're certainly hard to sympathize with. But although this chapter could be titled How Not to Treat Your Children instead of being titled Comfort in Sorrow, I think it's going to be interesting for you because you will see two very different relationships with children happening from two different families. And that's kind of cool, albeit sad. But we also are going to get to see, for I think the first time, a new paradigm start to take place. And of course, this is volume 2. This would be volume 2, chapter 3, if you have a book that's numbered that way, or chapter 28 if you don't. But we're going to see a new paradigm start to rise. And that is that Margaret, in today's chapter, I think is going to become the pivot between two opposing views of life in the workplace. And that would be Mr. Thornton and Mr. Higgins. And I think she's also going to become the pivot point between two different religious, or maybe not religious, but philosophical stances. And that would be her father and Mr. Higgins. So you're going to see Margaret start to be positioned a little bit differently from how she was in the first half of the book. And I think this is the chapter where that motion starts to happen. So watch the dichotomy, that split between how Margaret treats Thornton and how Margaret treated Thornton out on the front step during the riot, and how she deals with Higgins in this chapter. We'll talk more about that when we come back from listening to the chapter. And you may recall last week we saw the death of Bessie Higgins, and young Mary came and asked Margaret to come and view the body, which Margaret has never done before. And so we pick up right where we left off this week with Margaret heading over to the Higgins household. Now, it being the Higgins household, there is going to be a lot of slang used, and I'm going to go over some of the finer points of some of the more lengthy conversations that they will be having today, because I want to make sure some of the things that get said are crystal clear, because I think they are interesting and important. The other thing is there are quite a few Bible verses that will be mentioned today. I have linked out to all of them from the show notes. So if you are interested in hearing more or seeing more of where these things came from, that'll make it easy for you. I can tell you right off the bat, at the very beginning of the chapter, you'll hear lines from the book of Revelations, the book of Isaiah, and the book of Psalms. And later, much later in the chapter, you will hear a reference to the chapter 14 of the book of Job. Of course, Job is the poor man who suffered so greatly in the Old Testament story. And you'll hear one final reference to a verse that mentions sour grapes and somebody having their teeth on edge. That actually comes from Ezekiel. And that is the final Bible verse. That's a lot of Bible verses to pack into one chapter. But like I said, I mean, the existential blues thing, the title for the podcast this week, it kind of does fit, because there's a lot of philosophy that gets discussed today. And I always have fun with that stuff. So I hope you do too. Ost means tried. Varsal is universal. Dreed is endured. And brossen is broken. And in context, you may not even hear that those words are odd, but if you saw them on the page, you'd go, "Rrr." So that's what those are. And I have transcribed that onto the show notes as well. So if you look at the literary links of interest for today's chapter, you'll find all of that. There's also something that gets mentioned, shining shoes with a candle stub. And at first I thought, what? And then I went and I found the coolest website. There is one man, a guy, who still makes traditional clogs in the old way. And he has a web page, and he has videos, and he has all this cool information. And so I linked out to his page, and from there you can get to his videos. But the clogs are not the kind of clogs I thought of. I was thinking of the kinds of clogs that I wear, which are Dansko clogs, and they're pretty heavy. But then, of course, there were other clogs, like when my mom lived in Holland, I think the wooden shoes that they had were referred to as clogs, those kind of heavy wooden shoes that if you were going to be walking around in the mud, keep yourself up above the muck as much as possible. So big, thick-soled wooden shoes. That is not what they're talking about. If this guy's website is at all accurate, and he claims to be Victorianly accurate, making up more words as I go recklessly, they don't look like the kind of clogs I thought they did, or I thought they would. So you can go take a look and see, but you can kind of understand that if you were, say, next to a stove and you had the stub end of a candle and you were rubbing the candle against your clogs and keeping it close to the stove or the fireplace, you'd wind up melting the wax right into the leather, and that would be A, great waterproofing, but B, something that you could then buff to a shine. So it does make sense. At first I was thinking, what? And then I went, oh, no, that's probably how people have been doing it for a really long time, Heather. I just don't have that many shoes that need to be shined, which is so sad, but there it is. And I think that is all you will need before we start to listen. So here we go with Chapter 28, or Volume 2, Chapter 3 of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Chapter 28. Comfort in Sorrow. Through cross to crown, and though thy spirit's life trials untold assail with giant strength, good cheer, good cheer. Soon ends the bitter strife, and thou shalt reign in peace with Christ at length. Kosgarten. Aye, sooth, we feel too strong in will to need thee on that road, but, woe being come, the soul is dumb that crieth not on God. Mrs. Browning. That afternoon she walked swiftly to the Higginses' house. Mary was looking out for her with a half-distrustful face. Margaret smiled into her eyes to reassure her. They passed quickly through the house-place, upstairs, and into the quiet presence of the dead. Then Margaret was glad that she had come. The face, often so weary with pain, so restless with troublous thoughts, had now the faint, soft smile of eternal rest upon it. The slow tears gathered into Margaret's eyes, but a deep calm entered her soul, and that was death. It looked more peaceful than life. All beautiful scriptures came into her mind. They rest from their labors. The weary are at rest. He giveth his beloved sleep. Slowly, slowly, Margaret turned away from the bed. Mary was humbly sobbing in the background. They went downstairs without a word. Resting his hand upon the house table, Nicholas Higgins stood in the midst of the floor. His great eyes startled open by the news he had heard as he came along the court from many busy tongues. His eyes were dry and fierce, studying the reality of her death, bringing himself to understand that her place should know her no more. For she had been sickly, dying so long that he had persuaded himself that she would not die, that she would pull through. Margaret felt as if she had no business to be there, familiarly acquainting herself with the surroundings of death which he, the father, had only just learnt. There had been a pause of an instant on the steep, crooked stair when she first saw him, but now she tried to steal past his abstracted gaze and to leave him in the solemn circle of his household misery. Mary sat down on the first chair she came to, and throwing her apron over her head, began to cry. The noise appeared to rouse him. He took sudden hold of Margaret's arm, and held her till he could gather the words to speak. They seemed dry. They came up thick and choked and hoarse. "Were you with her? Did you see her die?" "No," replied Margaret, standing still with the utmost patience. Now she found herself perceived. It was some time before he spoke again, but he kept his hold on her arm. "All men must die," said he at last, with a strange sort of gravity which first suggested to Margaret the idea that he had been drinking, not enough to intoxicate himself, but enough to make his thoughts bewildered. "But she were younger than me." Still he pondered over the event, not looking at Margaret, though he grasped her tight. Suddenly he looked up at her with a wild, searching inquiry in his glance. "You sure and certain she's dead? Not in a dwam of faint? She's been so before, often." "She is dead," replied Margaret. She felt no fear in speaking to him, though he hurt her arm with his grip, and wild gleams came across the stupidity of his eyes. "She is dead," she said. He looked at her still with that searching look, which seemed to fade out of his eyes as he gazed. Then he suddenly let go his hold of Margaret, and, throwing his body half across the table, he shook it and every piece of furniture in the room with his violent sobs. Mary came trembling towards him. "Get thee gone! Get thee gone!" he cried, striking wildly and blindly at her. "What do I care for thee?" Margaret took her hand and held it softly in hers. He tore his hair, he beat his head against the hard wood, then he lay exhausted and stupid. Still his daughter and Margaret did not move. Mary trembled from head to foot. At last, it might have been a quarter of an hour, it might have been an hour, he lifted himself up. His eyes were swollen and bloodshot, and he seemed to have forgotten that anyone was by. He scowled at the watchers when he saw them. He shook himself heavily, gave them one more sullen look, spoke never a word, but made for the door. "Oh, father, father," said Mary, throwing herself upon his arm. "Not tonight, any night but tonight. Oh, help me. He's going out to drink again. Father, I'll not leave you. You may strike, but I'll not leave you. She told me last of all to keep you for drink." But Margaret stood in the doorway, silent yet commanding. He looked up at her defyingly. "It's my own house. Stand out of the way, wench, or I'll make you." He had shaken off Mary with violence. He looked ready to strike Margaret, but she never moved a feature, never took her deep, serious eyes off him. He stared back on her with gloomy fierceness. If she had stirred hand or foot, he would have thrust her aside with even more violence than he had used to his own daughter, whose face was bleeding from her fall against a chair. "What are you looking at me in that way for?" asked he at last, daunted and awed by her severe calm. "If you think for to keep me from going what gate I choose because she loved you, and in my own house too, where I never asked you to come, you're mistaken. It's very hard upon a man that he can't go to the only comfort left." Margaret felt that he acknowledged her power. What could she do next? He had seated himself on a chair close to the door, half conquered, half resenting, intending to go out as soon as she left her position, but unwilling to use the violence he had threatened not 5 minutes before. Margaret laid her hand on his arm. "Come with me," she said. "Come and see her." The voice in which she spoke was very low and solemn, but there was no fear or doubt expressed in it, either of him or of his compliance. He sullenly rose up. He stood uncertain, with dogged irresolution upon his face. She waited him there, quietly and patiently waited for his time to move. He had a strange pleasure in making her wait, but at last he moved towards the stairs. She and he stood by the corpse. Her last words to Mary were, "Keep my father from drink." "It canna hurt her now," muttered he. "Naught can hurt her now." Then, raising his voice to a wailing cry, he went on. "We may quarrel and fall out. We may make peace and be friends. We may clem to skin and bone, and not o' all our griefs will ever touch her more. There's a portion on 'em, what with hard work first, and sickness at last, has led the life of a dog, and to die without knowing one good piece of rejoicing in all her days. Nay, wench, whatever her said, I can know naught about it now, and I mun ha' a sup o' drink just to steady me against sorrow." "No," said Margaret, softening with his softened manner. "You shall not. If her life has been what you say, at any rate, she did not fear death as some do. Oh, you should have heard her speak of the life to come, the life hidden with God, that she is now gone to." He shook his head, glancing sideways up at Margaret as he did so. His pale, haggard face struck her painfully. "You are sorely tired. Where have you been all day? Not at work?" "Not at work, sure enough," said he, with a short, grim laugh. "Not at what do you call work. I were at the committee till I was sickened out with trying to make fools hear reason. I were fetched to Boucher's wife afore 7 this morning. She's bedfast, but she were raving and raging to know where her dunder-headed brute of a chap was, as if I'd to keep him, as if he were fit to be ruled by me. The damned fool was put his foot in all our plans. And I've walked my feet sore with going about for to see men who wouldn't be seen, now the law is raised again us. And I were sore-hearted too, which is worse than sore-footed, and if I did see a friend who asked to treat me, I never knew who lay a-dying here. Bess, lass, thou'd believe me? Thou wouldst, wouldn't thou?" turning to the poor dumb form with wild appeal. "I am sure," said Margaret, "I am sure you did not know. It was quite sudden. But now, you see, it would be different. You do know. You do see her lying there. You hear what she said with her last breath. You will not go?" No answer. In fact, where was he to look for comfort? "Come home with me," said she at last, with a bold venture, half trembling at her own proposal as she made it. "At least you shall have some comfortable food, which I'm sure you need." "Your father's a parson?" asked he, with a sudden turn in his ideas. "He was," said Margaret shortly. "I'll go and take a dish of tea with him, since you've asked me. I've many a thing I often wish to say to a parson, and I'm not particular as to whether he's preaching now or not." Margaret was perplexed. His drinking tea with her father, who would be totally unprepared for his visitor, her mother so ill, seemed utterly out of the question, and yet, if she drew back now, it would be worse than ever, sure to drive him to the gin shop. She thought that if she could only get him to their own house, it was so great a step gained that she would trust to the chapter of accidents for the next. "Goodbye, old wench. We've parted company at last, we have. But thou'st been a blessing to thy father ever since thou were born. Bless thy white lips, lass. They've a smile on 'em now, and I'm glad to see it once again, though I'm lone and forlorn for evermore." He stooped down and fondly kissed his daughter, covered up her face, and turned to follow Margaret. She had hastily gone downstairs to tell Mary of the arrangement, to say it was the only way she could think of to keep him from the gin palace, to urge Mary to come too, for her heart smote her at the idea of leaving the poor affectionate girl alone. But Mary had friends among the neighbours, she said, who would come in and sit a bit with her. It was all right, but father— He was there by them as she would have spoken more. He had shaken off his emotion, as if he was ashamed of having ever given way to it, and had even o'erleaped himself so much that he assumed a sort of bitter mirth, like the crackling of thorns under a pot. "I'm going to take my tea with her father, I am." But he slouched his cap low down over his brow as he went out into the street, and looked neither to the right nor to the left while he tramped along by Margaret's side. He feared being upset by the words, still more the looks, of sympathizing neighbours. So he and Margaret walked in silence. As he got near the street in which he knew she lived, he looked down at his clothes, his hands and shoes. "I should may happen to clean myself first." It certainly would have been desirable, but Margaret assured him he should be allowed to go into the yard and have soap and towel provided. She could not let him slip out of her hands just then. While he followed the house servant along the passage and through the kitchen, stepping cautiously on every dark mark in the pattern of the oilcloth in order to conceal his dirty footprints, Margaret ran upstairs. She met Dixon on the landing. "How is Mamma? Where is Papa?" Mrs. was tired and gone into her own room. She had wanted to go to bed, but Dixon had persuaded her to lie down on the sofa and have her tea brought to her there. It would be better than getting restless by being too long in bed. So far so good, but where was Mr. Hale? In the drawing-room. Margaret went in half breathless with the hurried story she had to tell. Of course, she told it incompletely, and her father was rather taken aback by the idea of the drunken weaver awaiting him in his quiet study, with whom he was expected to drink tea, and on whose behalf Margaret was anxiously pleading. The meek, kind-hearted Mr. Hale would have readily tried to console him in his grief, but, unluckily, the point Margaret dwelt upon most forcibly was the fact of his having been drinking, and her having brought him home with her as a last expedient to keep him from the gin shop. One little event had come out of another so naturally that Margaret was hardly conscious of what she had done, till she saw the slight look of repugnance on her father's face. "Oh, Papa, he really is a man you will not dislike, if you won't be shocked to begin with." "But, Margaret, to bring a drunken man home, and your mother so ill." Margaret's countenance fell. "I am sorry, Papa. He is very quiet. He is not tipsy at all. He was only rather strange at first, but that might be the shock of poor Bessie's death." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Hale took hold of her sweet, pleading face in both his hands and kissed her forehead. "It is all right, dear. I'll go and make him as comfortable as I can, and do you attend to your mother. Only, if you can come in and make a third in the study, I shall be glad." "Oh, yes, thank you." But as Mr. Hale was leaving the room, she ran after him. "Papa, you must not wonder at what he says. He does not believe in much of what we do." "Oh, dear, a drunken infidel weaver," said Mr. Hale to himself in dismay. But to Margaret he only said, "If your mother goes to sleep, be sure you come directly." Margaret went into her mother's room. Mrs. Hale lifted herself up from a doze. "When did you write to Frederick, Margaret? Yesterday or the day before?" "Yesterday, Mamma." "Yesterday? And the letter went?" "Yes, I took it myself." Oh, Margaret, I'm so afraid of his coming. If he should be recognized, if he should be taken, if he should be executed after all these years that he has kept away and lived in safety. I keep falling asleep and dreaming that he is caught and being tried. Oh, Mamma, don't be afraid. There will be some risk, no doubt, but we will lessen it as much as ever we can. And it is so little. Now, if we were at Helston, there would be 20, 100 times as much. There, everybody would remember him, and if there was a stranger known to be in the house, they would be sure to guess it was Frederick. While here, nobody knows or cares for us enough to notice what we do. Dixon will keep the door like a dragon, won't you, Dixon, while he's here? They'll be clever if they come in past me, said Dixon, showing her teeth at the bare idea. And he need not go out, except in the dusk, poor fellow. Poor fellow, echoed Mrs. Hale. But I almost wish you had not written. Would it be too late to stop him if you wrote again, Margaret? I'm afraid it would, Mamma, said Margaret, remembering the urgency with which she had entreated him to come directly if he wished to see his mother alive. I always dislike that doing things in such a hurry, said Mrs. Hale. Margaret was silent. Come now, Mum, said Dixon with a kind of cheerful authority. You know seeing Master Frederick is just the very thing of all others you're longing for. And I'm glad Miss Margaret wrote off straight without shilly-shallying. I've had a great mind to do it myself, and we'll keep him snug, depend upon it. There's only Martha in the house that would not do a good deal to save him on a pinch, and I've been thinking she might go and see her mother just at that very time. She's been saying once or twice she should like to go, for her mother has had a stroke since she came here, only she didn't like to ask. But I'll see about her being safe off as soon as we know when he comes. God bless him. So take your tea, Mum, in comfort, and trust to me. Mrs. Hale did trust in Dixon more than in Margaret. Dixon's words quieted her for the time. Margaret poured out the tea in silence, trying to think of something agreeable to say, but her thoughts made answer something like Daniel O'Rourke when the man in the moon asked him to get off his reaping hook. The more you ax us, the more we won't stir. The more she tried to think of something, anything besides the danger to which Frederick would be exposed, the more closely her imagination clung to the unfortunate idea presented to her. Her mother prattled with Dixon and seemed to have utterly forgotten the possibility of Frederick being tried and executed. Utterly forgotten that, at her wish, if by Margaret's deed, he was summoned into this danger. Her mother was one of those who throw out terrible possibilities, miserable probabilities, unfortunate chances of all kinds, as a rocket throws out sparks. But if the sparks light on some combustible matter, they smoulder first and burst out into a frightful flame at last. Margaret was glad when, her filial duties gently and carefully performed, she could go down into the study. She wondered how her father and Higgins had got on. In the first place, the decorous, kind-hearted, simple, old-fashioned gentleman had unconsciously called out by his own refinement and courteousness of manner all the latent courtesy in the other. Mr. Hale treated all his fellow creatures alike. It never entered into his head to make any difference because of their rank. He placed a chair for Nicholas, stood up till he, at Mr. Hale's request, took a seat, and called him invariably Mr. Higgins instead of the curt Nicholas or Higgins to which the drunken infidel weaver had been accustomed. But Nicholas was neither an habitual drunkard nor a thorough infidel. He drank to drown care, as he would have himself expressed it, and he was infidel so far as he had never yet found any form of faith to which he could attach himself, heart and soul. Margaret was a little surprised and very much pleased when she found her father and Higgins in earnest conversation, each speaking with gentle politeness to the other, however their opinions might clash. Nicholas, clean, tidied, if only at the pump trough, and quiet-spoken, was a new creature to her, who had only seen him in the rough independence of his own hearthstone. He had slicked his hair down with the fresh water. He had adjusted his neck-handkerchief and borrowed an odd candle end to polish his clogs with, and there he sat, enforcing some opinion on her father, with a strong Darkshire accent, it is true, but with a lowered voice and a good earnest composure on his face. Her father, too, was interested in what his companion was saying. He looked round as she came in, smiled, and quietly gave her his chair, and then sat down afresh as quickly as possible, and with a little bow of apology to his guest for the interruption. Higgins nodded to her as a sign of greeting, and she softly adjusted her working materials on the table and prepared to listen. "As I was a-saying, sir, I reckon you'd not have much belief in you if you'd lived here, if you'd been bred here. I ask your pardon if I use wrong words, but what I mean by belief just now is thinking on sayings and maxims and promises made by folk you never saw, about the things in the life you never saw, no one else. Now you say these things are true things, and true sayings and a true life. I just say, where's the proof? There's many and many a one wiser and scores better learned than I am around me. Folk who've had time to think on these things, while my time has had to be given up to getting my bread. Well, I sees these people. Their lives is pretty much open to me. They're real folk. They don't believe in the Bible, not they. They may say they do for form's sake, but, Lord, sir, do you think their first cry in the morning is, "What shall I do to get hold on eternal life?" Or, "What shall I do to fill my purse this blessed day? Where shall I go? What bargains shall I strike?" The purse and the gold and the notes is real things, things as can be felt and touched, them's realities, and eternal life is all a talk, very fit for. I ask your pardon, sir, you're a parson at the work, I believe. Well, I'll never speak disrespectful of a man in the same fix as I'm in myself, but I'll just ask you another question, sir, and I do not want you to answer it, only to put in your pipe and smoke it afore you go for to set down on us, who only believe in what we see, as fools and noddies. If salvation and life to come and what not was true, not in men's words, but in men's heart's core, don't you not think they din us with as they do with political economy? They're mighty anxious to come round us with that piece of wisdom, but the other would be a greater conversion, if it were true. But the masters have nothing to do with your religion. All that they are connected with you is in trade, so they think, and all that it concerns them, therefore, to rectify your opinions in is the science of trade. I'm glad, sir, said Higgins with a curious wink of his eye, that you put in so they think. I'd ha' thought you a hypocrite, I'm afeard, if you hadn't, for all you're a parson, or rather because you're a parson. You see, if you'd spoken o' religion as a thing that, if it was true, it didn't concern all men to press on all men's attention above everything else in this versal earth, I should have thought you a knave for to be a parson, and I'd rather think you a fool than a knave. No offence, I hope, sir. None at all. You consider me mistaken, and I consider you far more fatally mistaken. I don't expect to convince you in a day, not in one conversation, but let us know each other and speak freely to each other about these things, and the truth will prevail. I should not believe in God if I did not believe that. Mr. Higgins, I trust whatever else you have given up, you believe. Mr. Hale's voice dropped low in reverence. You believe in him? Nicholas Higgins suddenly stood straight, stiff up. Margaret started to her feet, for she thought by the working of his face he was going into convulsions. Mr. Hale looked at her dismayed. At last, Higgins found words. "Man, I could fell you to the ground for tempting me. Whatten business have you to try me with your doubts? Think o' her lying there, after the life her's led, and think then how you deny me the one sole comfort left, that there is a God, and that he set her life. I do not believe she'll ever live again," said he, sitting down and drearily going on as if to the unsympathizing fire. "I do not believe in any other life than this, in which she dreed such trouble, and had such never-ending care, and I cannot bear to think it were all a set o' chances that might have been altered with a breath o' wind. There's many a time when I've thought I did not believe in God, but I never put it fair out before me in words as many men do. I may ha' laughed at those who did to brave it out like, but I've looked round at after to see if he heard me, if so be there was a he. But today, when I'm left desolate, I wonnot listen to you with your questions and your doubts. There's but one thing steady and quiet in all this reeling world, and reason or no reason, I'll cling to that. It's all very well for happy folk." Margaret touched his arm very softly. She had not spoken before, nor had he heard her rise. "Nicholas, we do not want to reason. You misunderstand my father. We do not reason. We believe, and so do you. It is the one sole comfort in such times." He turned round and caught her hand. "Aye, 'tis, brushing away the tears with the back of his hand. "But, you know, she's lying dead at home, and I'm welly dazed with sorrow, and at times I hardly know what I'm saying. It's as if speeches folk have made, clever and smart things as I've thought at the time, come up now my heart's welly broken. The strike's failed as well, don't you know that, miss? I were coming home to ask her like a beggar as I am for a bit of comfort in that trouble, and I were knocked down by one who telled me she were dead, just dead, that were all. But that were enough for me." Mr. Hale blew his nose and got up to snuff the candles in order to conceal his emotion. "He's not an infidel, Margaret. How could you say so?" muttered he reproachfully. "I've a good mind to read him the 14th chapter of Job." "Not yet, Papa, I think. Perhaps not at all. Let us ask him about the strike, and give him all the sympathy he needs and hope to have from poor Bessie." So they questioned and listened. The workmen's calculations were based, like too many of the masters, on false premises. They reckoned on their fellow men as if they possessed the calculable powers of machines, no more, no less, no allowance for human passions getting the better of reason, as in the case of Boucher and the rioters, and believing that the representations of their injuries would have the same effect on strangers far away as the injuries, fancied or real, had upon themselves. They were consequently surprised and indignant at the poor Irish who had allowed themselves to be imported and brought over to take their places. This indignation was tempered in some degree by contempt for them Irishers, and by pleasure at the idea of the bungling way in which they would set to work, and perplex their new masters with their ignorance and stupidity, strange exaggerated stories of which were already spreading through the town. But the most cruel cut of all was that of the Milton workmen, who had defied and disobeyed the commands of the Union to keep the peace, whatever came, who had originated discord in the camp, and spread the panic of the law being arrayed against them. "And so the strike is at an end," said Margaret. "Aye, miss, it's save as save can. The factory doors will need open wide tomorrow to let in all who be axing for work, if it's only just to show they'd naught to do with a measure which, if we had been made of the right stuff, would have brought wages up to a point they'd not been at this 10 year.
"You'll get work, shan't you?" asked Margaret. "You're a famous workman, are not you?"
"Amper'll let me work at his mill when he cuts off his right hand, not before and not after," said Nicholas quietly. Margaret was silenced and sad.
"About the wages," said Mr. Hale. "You'll not be offended, but I think you made some sad mistakes. I should like to read you some remarks in a book I have."
He got up and went to his bookshelves. "You needn't trouble yourself, sir," said Nicholas. "Their book stuff goes in at one ear and out at t'other. I can make note on it. Afore Amper and me had this split, the overlooker telled him I was stirring up the men to ask for higher wages, and Amper met me one day in the yard. He'd a thin book in his hand, and he says, 'Higgins, I'm told you're one of those damned fools that think you can get higher wages for asking for 'em, aye, and keep 'em up too when you forced 'em up. Now, I'll give you a chance and try if you've any sense in you. Here's a book written by a friend of mine, and if you read it you'll see how wages find their own level without either masters or men having aught to do with them, except the men cut their own throats with striking like the confounded noodles they are. Well now, sir, I put it to you, being a parson, and having been in the preaching line, and having had to try and bring folk o'er to what you thought was a right way of thinking. Did you begin by calling 'em fools and such like, or didn't you rather give 'em some kind words at first to make 'em ready for to listen and be convinced if they could? And in your preaching, did you stop every now and then and say, after them and after yourself, 'But you're such a pack of fools that I've a strong notion it's no use me trying to put sense into you'? I were not in the best state alone for taking in what Amper's friend had to say. I were so vexed at the way it were put to me, but I thought, come, I'll see what these chaps have got to say, and try if it's them or me as is the noodle. So I took the book and tugged at it, but, Lord bless you, it went on about capital and labour and capital till it fair sent me off to sleep. I never could rightly fix it in my mind which was which, and it spoke on 'em as if they was virtues or vices, and what I wanted for to know were the rights o' men, whether they were rich or poor, so be they only were men."
"But for all that," said Mr. Hale, "and granting to the full the offensiveness, the folly, the unchristianness of Mr. Hamper's way of speaking to you in recommending his friend's book, yet if it told you what he said it did, that wages find their own level, and that the most successful strike can only force them up for a moment, to sink in far greater proportion afterwards, in consequence of that very strike, the book would have told you the truth."
"Well, sir," said Higgins rather doggedly, "it might, or it might not. There's two opinions go to settling that point. But suppose it was truth double strong, it were no truth to me if I couldna take it in. I dare say there's truth in yon Latin book on your shelves, but it's gibberish and not truth to me unless I know the meaning of the words. If you, sir, or any other knowledgeable patient man come to me and says he'll learn me what the words mean, and not blow me up if I'm a bit stupid, or forget how one thing hangs on another, why, in time, I may get to see the truth of it, or I may not. I'll not be bound to say I shall end in thinking the same as any man, and I'm not one who think truth can be shaped out in words all neat and clean, as the men at the foundry cut out sheet iron. Same bones won't go down with everyone. It'll stick here in this man's throat and there into others. Let alone that, when down, it may be too strong for this one, too weak for that. Folk who sets up to doctor the world with their truth mun suit different for different minds, and be a bit tender in the way of giving it to, or the poor sick fools may spit it out in their faces. Now Amper first gives me a box on my ear, and then he throws his big bolus at me and says he reckons it'll do me no good, I'm such a fool. But there it is.
I wish some of the kindest and wisest of the masters would meet some of you men and have a good talk on these things. It would surely be the best way of getting over your difficulties, which I do believe arise from your ignorance, excuse me, Mr. Higgins, on subjects which it is for the mutual interest of both masters and men should be well understood by both. I wonder," half to his daughter, "if Mr. Thornton might not be induced to do such a thing."
"Remember, Papa," said she in a very low voice, "what he said one day about governments, you know?" She was unwilling to make any clearer allusion to the conversation they had held on the mode of governing workpeople, by giving men intelligence enough to rule themselves, or by a wise despotism on the part of the master, for she saw that Higgins had caught Mr. Thornton's name, if not the whole of the speech. Indeed, he began to speak of him.
"Thornton, he's the chap as wrote off at once for these Irishers and led to the riot that ruined the strike. Even Hamper with all his bullying would have waited for a while, but it's a word and a blow with Thornton. And now, when the Union would have thanked him for following up the chase after Boucher, and them chaps as went right again our commands, it's Thornton who steps forward and coolly says that, as the strike's at an end, he, as party injured, doesn't want to press the charges against the rioters. I thought he'd had more pluck. I thought he'd have carried his point and had his revenge in an open way. But, says he, one in court told me his very words, they are well known. They will find the natural punishment of their conduct in the difficulty they will meet with in getting employment. That will be severe enough. I only wish they'd cotched Boucher and had him up before Hamper. I see the old tiger sitting on him. Would he have let them off? Not he."
"Mr. Thornton was right," said Margaret. "You are angry against Boucher, Nicholas, or else you would be the first to see that where the natural punishment would be severe enough for the offence, any farther punishment would be something like revenge."
"My daughter is no great friend of Mr. Thornton's,"
said Mr. Hale, smiling at Margaret, while she, as red as any carnation, began to work with double diligence.
"But I believe what she says is the truth. I like him for it." "Well, sir, this strike has been a weary piece of business to me, and you'll not wonder if I'm a bit put out with seeing it fail just for a few men who would not suffer in silence and hold out brave and firm."
"You forget," said Margaret. "I don't know much of Boucher, but the only time I saw him it was not his own sufferings he spoke of, but those of his sick wife, his little children."
"True, but he were not made of iron himself. He'd a cried out for his own sorrows next. He were not one to bear."
"How came he into the Union?" asked Margaret innocently. "You don't seem to have much respect for him, nor gained much good from having him in." Higgins' brow clouded. He was silent for a minute or two. Then he said, shortly enough,
"It's not for me to speak of the Union. What they does, they does. Them that is of a trade mun hang together, and if they're not willing to take their chance along with the rest, the Union has ways and means."
Mr. Hale saw that Higgins was vexed at the turn the conversation had taken, and was silent. Not so Margaret, though she saw Higgins' feeling as clearly as he did. By instinct she felt that if he could but be brought to express himself in plain words, something clear would be gained on which to argue for the right and the just. "And what are the Union's ways and means?" He looked up at her as if on the point of dogged resistance to her wish for information. But her calm face, fixed on his, patient and trustful, compelled him to answer.
"Well, if a man doesn't belong to the Union, them as works next looms has orders not to speak to him. If he's sorry or ill, it's all the same. He's out of bounds. He's none of us. He comes among us, he works among us, but he's none of us. In some places, them's fine who speaks to him. You try that, miss. Try living a year or two among them as looks away if you look at 'em. Try working within 2 yards of crowds of men who, you know, have a grinding grudge at you in their hearts, to whom if you say you're glad, not an eye brightens nor lip moves, to whom, if your heart's heavy, you can never say naught, because they'll ne'er take notice on your sighs or sad looks, and a man's no man who groan out loud about folk asking him what's the matter. Just you try that, miss. 10 hours for 300 days, and you'll know a bit what the Union is.
Why, said Margaret, what tyranny this is! Nay, Higgins, I don't care one straw for your anger. I know you can't be angry with me if you would, and I must tell you the truth, that I never read in all the history I have read of a more slow, lingering torture than this. And you belong to the Union? And you talk of the tyranny of the masters?
Nay, said Higgins, you may say what you like. The dead stand between you and every angry word of mine. Do you think I forget who's lying there and how her loved you? And it's the masters as made us sin if the Union is a sin. Not this generation, maybe, but their fathers. Their fathers ground our fathers to the very dust, ground us to powder. Parson, I reckon I've heard my mother read out a text. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. It's so with them. In those days of sore oppression the Unions began. It were a necessity. It's a necessity now, according to me. It's a withstanding of injustice, past, present, or to come. It may be like war, along with it comes crimes, but I think it were greater crime to let it alone. Our only chance is binding men together in one common interest. And if some are cowards and some are fools, they mun come along and join the great march whose only strength is in numbers.
Oh, said Mr. Hale, sighing, your Union in itself would be beautiful, glorious. It would be Christianity itself, if it were but for an end which affected the good of all, instead of that of merely one class as opposed to another.
I reckon it's time for me to be going, sir,
said Higgins as the clock struck 10. Home, said Margaret very softly. He understood her and took her offered hand.
Oh, miss, you may trust me, though I am one of the Union.
I do trust you most thoroughly, Nicholas. Stay, said Mr. Hale, hurrying to the bookshelves. Mr. Higgins, I'm sure you'll join us in family prayer.
Higgins looked at Margaret doubtfully.
Her grave, sweet eyes met his. There was no compulsion, only deep interest in them. He did not speak, but he kept his place. Margaret, the churchwoman, her father, the dissenter, Higgins, the infidel, knelt down together. It did them no harm.
So right there at the end, you start to get that dichotomy. You start to see Margaret, the churchwoman, just meaning that she is still a member of the Church of England, her father, the dissenter, and Higgins, the infidel. But he's not. I don't know if it was clear enough. I had to really reread and re-listen to the part of the chapter where Margaret's father asks if Higgins believes in God. And Higgins is thinking that by asking that question, what he's really saying is, I don't believe in God. That's why I stopped being a pastor. Do you? And so he's saying, after he stands up and gets upset, don't take the one thing I've got going for me away. I don't believe she'll ever live again, but I need to believe that she's with God. That's where she wanted to go. That's what I have to believe. And I think that that's the really interesting thing that Gaskell's doing here is she's making a very clear definition between believing in God and having issues with an organized religion. And I thought she kind of did a lovely job with that, because that's a pretty complicated thing. We still have complications with getting that across. And here we have, back in 1850, we already have that starting. And did you notice way back at the beginning of the chapter how she just stood in the doorway, stood in the doorway without moving. And there was that line that if she had moved just a little bit, moved a hand, moved an arm, moved an eyebrow, he would have hit her. He would have knocked her out of the way. But because she was that Margaret, that stony, strong, kind of in your face Margaret, he just couldn't do it. Just like with Thornton, he had to listen to her. And the writers had to pay attention until some schmuck tossed a pebble the size of a rock. I also loved, and I think it went some distance in redeeming Mr. Hale for me, that when Higgins, the infidel weaver, shows up in his study, he pulls out the chair for him and has him sit down first and calls him Mr. Higgins. He doesn't refer to him as a hand, which would be insulting. He is Mr. Higgins, and he is there to talk and to discuss. And I thought it was lovely, the moment when Mr. Hale says, Higgins says, "I'd rather think you a fool than a knave. No offense, I hope, sir." And Hale says, "None at all. You consider me mistaken, and I consider you far more fatally mistaken. I don't expect to convince you in a day, not in one conversation. But let us know each other and speak freely to each other about these things, and the truth will prevail. I should not believe in God if I did not believe in that." And I thought, boy, if all those screaming, shrill voices out on the internet and on TV and everywhere, if they could take a page from Mr. Hale's book right there and just calm down and listen. And I thought it was really interesting, the conversation about the economics of the strike and how Higgins didn't understand where the masters were coming from and where they were going. And the masters didn't understand the strikers. And Gaskell, I think, is doing a pretty marvelous job of letting us see both sides, which has got to be shockingly difficult to do. And I particularly liked that Higgins, when Hamper was giving him a hard time about reading the book, said that he didn't want to know about capital and labor. He wanted to know about the rights of men. If I work a day's job, why can't I make a living wage? And it's just so clear. It's transparent. It's clear that nothing much has changed, but it's so clear that the masters in the hands, the management and the workers don't have a clue about each other or the strains on each other. And not only that, but that the not understanding each other goes all the way to them each thinking the other is stupid. You know, that the masters are stupid to think that the laborers aren't going to rise up, and they just don't understand what's really going on. And the masters think that the laborers are all, lazy, good for nothing louts who are just a bunch of stupid people. And if they were smarter, they would have risen to management like Thornton. And I think, having seen Mr. Thornton's mother in action a few times, I think we can safely say that not everybody would have necessarily been able to rise to the level of Mr. Thornton if they didn't have a mother who was so thrifty and so determined and so focused that I don't think anybody is going to do that alone. And Thornton, it was a family affair getting Thornton to where he is and getting the mill to where it is. And it makes sense then to see Mrs. Thornton being so proprietary about the mill, because in many ways it's her achievement as well, and she should be proud of it. And I thought it was also interesting today that we really saw, for the first time, kind of the inner workings of the union and how Boucher came to be part of the union, and also Higgins's disappointment with people not being able to restrain themselves and just trust the process. I have been in Higgins's position in vaguely similar situations. And it is incredibly frustrating to watch people cut their nose off to spite their face. You know, it's just going against their own self-interest, and they don't get it. And it's incredibly difficult to watch, and it is incredibly depressing to watch as well. And then for poor Higgins to come home and find that Bessie is gone just had to be horrible. But as good Victorians, they end the chapter in prayer, and that can only be a good thing. So we have a nice little resolution. And next week, all sorts of stuff happens. I'm smashing 2 chapters together, and I hope you enjoy them. I hope you enjoyed today's chapter 2. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye. Like Craftlit? Leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, like us on Facebook, or leave a link to us when you comment on literary blogs. You can listen via iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Craftlit.com, or a dedicated Android, iOS, and Windows 8 app. You can use the same free Craftlit app to access premium subscriber content on the go. Craftlit is and has been made possible by the support of its listeners, and for that, I am truly grateful. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.